This is the LatinNews Podcast. I'm Richard McCall, your host here in Bogota, Colombia, and our very special guest this week is none other than Jenny Pearce, research professor at the Latin American Caribbean Center of the London School of Economics, and also an unrivaled knowledge for Colombia. And we're going to be talking about, well, Colombian politics, President Petro, and well, let's talk about, challenges ahead, and of course, this first year of Gustavo Petro's presidency. So welcome on the LatinNews Podcast, Jenny.
Thank you very much. Very pleased to be here.
I know it's a great honor for us to speak to you here, because I know you're traveling a lot and doing a lot of investigation into Colombia at the time. But okay, so, let's get into this. President Petro, 1 year in now, well, a bit longer than 1 year in, things seem to be a little bit rocky. At least we look at the opinion polls. They don't seem to be very much in his favor. Reforms are, again, on unstable ground. But we can say that this is a politician, a president, trying to work for the good of the country.
Yes, I believe he is. And you don't get many presidents who've had a life as he has had. He's been tortured, imprisoned, forced into clandestinity, was in an armed guerrilla group, although he wasn't a combatant. But he comes from a very particular history. And I think it's important to recall that, obviously. But also, he's an interesting man in terms of an economist, an intellectual. He went to the University of Louvain at one point in his life after he was actually being threatened again, only about 10 years ago or so, and came in touch with the idea of climate change. So he's come from a left background, but I would say he's not stuck in some left past. I think he's opened himself up to some new ideas. Climate change is one of them, but I also think he's much more what we would have called in the sociological, philosophical language, a sort of post-structuralist, Foucauldian a type of thinker, very interested in some of the Italian post-structuralist thinkers. And so an interesting man.
Mm-hmm. He is an interesting man indeed, and he came to I think one thing that was very refreshing in his inauguration speech was, well, two things, in fact, well, many things, but the two things that really appealed to me was that he did talk about saving lives when he spoke to the armed forces. You're going to be judged on saving lives, not lives taken, which I thought was a wonderful about turn of, many, or I guess time immemorial here in Colombia. And the second thing was he talked about various violences that affect Colombia. And I thought this is a new way of thinking. Have we seen this being put into play in this last year, in this year of his presidency?
I see it in what he's attempting to do. I see someone who, as you say, understands violence in a very different way. He's lived it. But also he's opened his mind to the fact there isn't just one kind of violence, the violence that people know about in terms of the armed movements and the criminal violences. He's aware of other kinds of violences. This is why he's also taken to an idea of security, human security, where he's looking at a security approach that would reduce violences. So he definitely has come to his presidency with very different ideas, certainly around that topic of violence, but also around what he understands by peace. And I suppose one would have to look at the idea of total peace, as he calls it, to see how he's trying to put this into practice. Now, it's a very complicated discussion. I'll try and be concise. But what he's trying to do with the idea of total peace is he's basically arguing that you can't just tackle one form of violence if you are going to really give sustainable peace to Colombia. So he obviously wants to implement what was not implemented in past presidencies around the peace accord of 2016. And he wants to sort of bring in some of the reforms that should have been done but weren't after that accord. But he's going further than that with the total peace. He's also suggesting that in order to address so many other violences other than the armed, more politicized violence, you have to actually engage with negotiations with criminal groups. And this is incredibly controversial. For me, he's a man beyond his times, if you see what I mean. I was in Medellin earlier this year, a city that has been through so many forms of violence. I've watched the mutation of various violences in Medellin. And even amongst people who've kind of really on the left and progressive, they find it hard to accept total peace, right? Because people, for instance, do not wish to conflate a political armed actor such as the ELN with the Clan del Golfo, which is clearly an overtly criminal actor. And so there's a huge discussion around precisely what could be achieved through total peace. But I actually believe on the ground, there are very important things going on. And one of them is to try and connect to the young men who get brought into armed groups, into criminal gangs. So already in Buenaventura and in the prison in Itagüí in Medellin, there are processes going on in which he's trying to invite gang members to come into a process of total peace via his peace commissioner, Danilo Rueda. Very controversial, but I do believe there's a serious intent behind this to try and think differently about violences in Colombia.
So really, we could sort of reorganize what paz total or total peace means, because it seems here the general understanding is total peace means every group, that in its totality, whereas you're suggesting that total peace is far more addressing all the different violences on the ground. It's far more theoretical than the I would say the superficial. We've got to get the Clan del Golfo or AGC out. We've got to get the Nueva Marquetalia, or we've got to get, rather than just that, it is far more theoretical in its reach. Then, we're looking at an entirely academic thing.
And maybe that's the problem, is that many people can't grasp a vision so broad. But there is real thinking behind it. For instance, one of the things is, well, if you don't tackle all the various armed groups, other armed groups are going to come in and take their place. So you need to sort of have an overall strategy that's going to bring in as many people as possible to stop the ongoing criminalities and violences. Now, clearly, this is an incredibly difficult thing to do. As you mentioned, the Marquetalia, Nueva Marquetalia, and of course with the Estado Mayor, even those ex-FARC groups provide a problem for Petro, because the Segundo Marquetalia was actually signed the peace accord, and then Ivan Marquez and others left it. And the Estado Mayor of the FARC, ex-FARC, are the ones that never signed the peace agreement. So he's got a problem as to, illegally, what can you offer? Can you offer the same thing to a group that left the peace accord, to a group that never signed a peace accord? And that's just those two groups, without talking about the ELN as another armed group and the Clan del Golfo as a criminal group. And then many would say that ultimately those ex-FARC groups have become merely criminal groups. So what is at stake here really is the fact that there is no agreement on how to understand all these different expressions of violences and criminality. And I think this makes it very difficult for the government to actually get convincing messages out there and to get the support of the population. And I think one of the things that I picked up in my most recent trip is that actually there's not a lot of confidence or trust in the process. People want to see quick fixes, and this is no way is there going to be a quick fix to the problems Colombia has faced with respect to these various armed actors and the various violences in which they're involved. That, I think, is one of his major problems. He will not get a quick fix, and in comes the media to attack him for the failures, and no one sees the effort on the ground. With very few personnel, he hasn't got enough people working around the whole total peace idea. And I think that's another problem. But innovative it is. And I think it's putting out there on the agenda a new way to think about violences and criminal groups, not only in Colombia, but I think America.
But I think this is so very interesting. And you talk about the messaging and a certain degree of incoherency of the messaging. I think that President Petro has this all in his head, but he's perhaps not great at getting it out to convince the rest of the population. And of course, he carries with him the stigma of having been, as a former guerrilla, the M19. And so there's a segment of society that will never forgive him. And, there's a justifiable reason for this, having, people who have lived through the worst years of the conflict, back in, we say, the 80s and the 90s, early 2000s, remembering this and remembering what's happened to family members and so on. And of course, they just can't get past this. But as you say, nothing previous to this has worked. The peace accord with the FARC, very, very good, complete peace accord, but of course then had 4 years of backtracking and being strangled by the presidency under Ivan Duque. And so, Colombia is picking up the broken pieces of that to go again. And you sort of think, as you said, Petro might be a man ahead of his time in what he's trying to do, but would we have been better in Colombia have Petro won over Duque to continue what was agreed in 2016 with the FARC, to push it through what was signed up into the constitution and so on?
Well, I think Petro is committed to the reforms that were at the heart of the peace accord of 2016. He absolutely has a track record of supporting agrarian reform. One of the issues that really matters to him, as well as climate change, is actually productivity in the rural area, food production, enabling peasants to grow food and have a good life in the rural areas and to look after nature. He really believes in that. And I think, he's also, of course, tackled the drugs issue, which no one else really wants to talk about still. But, he is very clear that until the drugs issue is tackled at an international level, he can't easily just himself solve that problem in Colombia. And I think he's right on that. So I think there's a lot of issues that Petro has in his head, at least, that really were much more in tune with the potentiality for that 2016 accord to actually really address something of what had led to some of the armed actors taking up their arms. Unfortunately, of course, that isn't how the way things have gone. And now, after the 4 years of the Duque government, he's now left trying to sort of offer this vision to a country, which, as you suggested, I think is quite cynical about what can be achieved. And faith in politicians isn't high, in the political system isn't high. People in rural areas still live with those armed actors, and that shouldn't be forgotten. I mean, I think Petro's trying to do something really important, but I know that it's the armed actors, although we have a ceasefire with the ELN and a very interesting process around trying to get some participatory discussions going on how to address the issues that matter to them. This will take time. And in the meantime, a lot of rural communities still suffer from armed actors. And just to look at the number of social leaders killed this year, the latest figure is something like 93 social leaders. That is, people who are really fighting to preserve rights and independence in many of the rural areas of Colombia, and who've been victims of violences over the years from varied armed actors.
And this is it, as you say, everybody wants a quick fix. This isn't a quick fix. This is generations we're looking at to sort of ease out and reconcile with, again, the violences that have taken place. Now, these social leaders, I think this ties us in nicely, are working tooth and nail to protect communities and for rights and so on, the environment and traditional practices. Of course, they're working overtime right now because it's election period. It's pre-election period for October. We have the local national elections, so governors, mayors, concejales and everything. And we're seeing that machinery moving into play now. How do we think that let's say the coalition of the Pacto Histórico, or of course, how do we think they're going to do in these October elections? Because it's very much a litmus test of the presidency.
it looks very pessimistic for Petro, and already his popularity has plummeted. But also, I think one should discuss the fact that he is a real enemy to a lot of people on the right and a lot of the elites. I don't use that word lightly. I work on that concept. I'm not sort of doing what some accuse some people of saying, well, the elites are to blame for everything. But I'm trying. I think there is evidence, and we have evidence that there is a sort of very high concentration of political and economic power in Colombia, and clearly Petro is in their sights, and a lot of the media are owned by very wealthy people, and they have absolutely amplified a whole series of what are broadly called scandals in Colombia, which are to do, and it relates to the issue you've just raised of elections, which is that Colombia has, I think, a real political culture of clientelistic electoral politics, of what I call transactional politics, in which money has flowed into campaigns. Rural and regional leaders have backed candidates that can, to enable them then to bring money to their areas. And all this has been part of Colombian politics for some time. Well, two major moments have really done a lot of damage to Petro, who stood on a platform of being anti-corruption, trying to change politics. And I'm one of a number of people, I think, who actually believes he's sincere, right? But the scandals that have been associated with him, one of them to do with campaign manager Armando Benedetti from the coast, and his own advisor and organizer, Laura Sarabia, who worked with Benedetti at one point, then came to work for Petro. And I won't go into all the details of this, but the scandal is about the fact that Benedetti he got a lot of money from dubious sources to invest in Petro's campaign. And then the worst one, which actually became the noise of the moment at the time of the exact anniversary of Petro's first year, which is his son, who ran his campaign also in the coast. And now we know, because first of all, his ex-girlfriend proclaimed it, and then he has admitted it, that money that came in from dubious sources went to his own personal enrichment, but also to the campaign of his father. He says in the latest interview that that Petro did not know that money was going into his campaign, but we've yet to see, because now there's going to be a further investigation. I think what's important is that Petro has made it very clear he's not going to interfere with the judicial process against his son. So that is really significant, that he's prepared to because many accuse him of being anti-institutional. I think he is actually trying to protect institutions, but nevertheless, this has done him a lot of damage, and it doesn't look good for October.
Yeah, I mean, the damage is done, as you say. The damage is done because we all know about Nicolas Petro, and we all know about this scandal, and whether it comes out or not, Gustavo Petro is clean and did not know anything about it. It's there, it's always going to be hanging over him. There's also a recent allegation that he took money from dubious sources in the Llanos as well, but I think he's also been able to shoot that one down, for using a poor metaphor there, but he's been able to deny that one. But this sort of brings me into it, as you talked about the political culture of sort of transactional politics. I mean, look at what's going on with the Odebrecht scandal, and that to me is one of the greatest, obviously, examples of this. And you had, I can't remember, President Uribe's Minister for Transport, who was taking a huge, I want to say Gabriel Garcia Moreno, he took a huge bribe. Then in President Santos's presidency, you have huge bribes going everywhere. Sarmiento is up in New York a week or so ago, and obviously has to pay a huge fine because they've been found guilty of these things, because the company is registered in the New York Stock Exchange. And yet there's no case going on here in Colombia. And this just goes to show, doesn't it? I mean, that you can be judged in the US, but in Colombia, it's business as usual.
Yes, absolutely. And I mean, the corruption that's embedded in this transactional politics means that so many contracts that you depend on the state, either regionally or locally and nationally, for these contracts. And the Odebrecht scandal shows construction company from Brazil that used all sorts of bribes in many countries of Latin America, but certainly this is impacted on the Santos government and on the on other governments. The corruption over the parapolitics scandal under Uribe, which was also about how paramilitary groups would pay for candidates who would support their positionings in Congress. A third of the Congress was actually packed with candidates that had been paid for by paramilitary groups who were involved in drugs trafficking, as well as in supporting the army to deal with counterinsurgency processes. So in other words, we've got a sort of deeply embedded corruption. And I think this means that anything that can be used against Petro will be used, but it is, I'm afraid, perhaps because I'm not Colombian and I go there, but I'm pretty shocked, to be honest, by the fact that I've always seen these corruption scandals in the history, and then all of a sudden it's Petro that's where the great scandal. Yeah, media are really sort of use it. Now, that doesn't mean to say I don't think Petro he should be acknowledging anything that was done to corrupt his campaign. He absolutely needs to acknowledge anything, and I'm not in any way letting him off if there's evidence that he did know and that the money flowed into his campaign from dubious sources. But just to say that this is an endemic problem in the nature of political life in Colombia. And it is certainly not just Petro, but I also question myself whether I don't actually believe Petro is a corrupt politician.
It's again, it depends on the people around him. And we look at someone like Armando Benedetti, and who is, a political lizard up there in the Caribbean coast, and who knows what's going on. I mean, he's from those big families up there that control so much and have their connections to everything, which brings us quite nicely to the work that you have been doing. And I know that you've been working with Juan David Velasco of the University of La Javeriana, and you have a report which is many years in the making, called Elites and Violence in Latin America. And Random House Penguin are going to be coming out with a book in the near future. We don't have a title, but it's about the problem of reforms in Colombia. So perhaps we'll start with the reforms and we'll talk about the elites. And because this has been one of the major stumbling blocks. Tax reform, majorly watered down, but pushed through. But then we're looking at all the other reforms that need to be done. Health, pension, justice, everything, electoral reforms, everything. But now that he does not have a majority, because the Pacto Histórico umbrella has splintered and the liberals have gone off elsewhere and so on, the U party, so Santos's party's gone off elsewhere, he's not going to be able to get these through, do we think?
It's going to be a very uphill journey. And Petro started off trying to build a national accord with different parties, opposition parties, and it lasted till April this year. But in the end, it broke down, and he's now surrounded himself much more with loyal people and has had to manage a Congress where he has deep opposition, and it's going to be very hard to get these reforms through. I have to say that a lot of people recognize Colombia needs reforms. And also it's very interesting that internationally, for instance, the OECD has not seen the reforms that Petro has put on the agenda as being particularly radical. No. So one of the things that's quite difficult to get a balanced view on is actually, are these the radical reforms of an ex-guerrilla of the left, or actually are these reforms that Colombia needs, and which have to be fairly transformatory to really make a difference to the country, but which are going to upset the interests of people who have an economic stake in some of the fields where Petro wants to introduce change. So I feel, having worked on Colombia for many years, and this work we've been doing around elites for many years as well, it does feel that there is a real problem in Colombia of reform. Now, for this book, and I'm not going to go into detail here, obviously, but I have gone back to the very different moments of attempts to make reforms in Colombia. And it is so interesting, from the reforms of 1936 and the reforms of what's called the Frente Nacional, when there was attempts to bring in agrarian reform, they get scuppered, right? It has been incredibly difficult to actually build a country where people as a whole, rural and urban, feel they have a stake in the society, they are recognized, their needs are going to be put on the agenda. And Colombia remains one of the most unequal countries in the world. Its land ownership is one of the highest Gini coefficients in the world. And that inequality and the poverty that's associated with it means that without serious reforms, it is hard to see how the country will progress. And I think this issue of how the country progresses is very important, because Colombia has a productivity problem. It has a problem of educational attainment, other than a few. I mean, our study of elites show how the elites of the country in different spheres, because we look at various elites, we call constellation of elites, how many come from the very same universities, right?
Yeah.
Los Andes obviously being one. And so it means that what you understand to be orthodoxy, or what you understand to be acceptable change, is very limited. You have in Colombia a very, very important technocratic elite. These are people that have been trained in Harvard. They're very good intellectuals, very brilliant minds, but they are very much part of an orthodoxy, and they've kept the country in a macroeconomic stability. And so that through the orthodoxy, but it does mean that they are very, very upset at any challenge to that orthodoxy, including questioning of the sort of neoliberal economic approach, the market-driven approach that has dominated the country for quite a long time. And what definitely Petro is trying to do is very influenced by Manuel Mazzucato, an economist at the UCL, and the idea that the state should be a driver. Her argument is that the state has always been a driver of most innovation, even though the market takes it forward. Petro is very much influenced by that. And so he's trying to bring the state in order to make transformations at very varied levels in society, from agrarian distribution and making sure agriculture gets its real investment in agriculture, to labor reforms, which give, I mean, the labor reform, which has been highly disputed by the opposition in Congress, because they think it will stop people employing, the formal sector employing more people, and that will badly affect the informal sector. It'll grow. The informal sector is already over 50% of the employment comes in the formal sector in Colombia. But actually, one of the things that Petro is trying to do is reduce working hours from 48 hours a week to 42. Well, when you think, we in England, we won the 8-hour day, 40-hour week some time ago. It's not revolutionary to seek to reduce working hours.
I mean, that's what it is. I think it's a whole issue of messaging, and then, of course, the platforms by which the messages get out. Because, as you mentioned, so many of the people in charge, or who have something perhaps in inverted commas to lose, are the ones who own these media outlets, and therefore, we don't get the kind of reporting perhaps needed, and let's reduce it so that people could understand it, and perhaps not deliver it in a very Petro academic fashion. But sometimes you get the feeling as well is that there is, again, that cadre of society here which is anything Petro, no. Anything at all, no, because again, the stigma surrounding it. I wanted to ask as well, as that, as we said, you said that he's surrounded himself with allies and people who are going to be faithful, blindly faithful to his cause and the cause. I see him in the next few years, or the final, let's say the next 3 years, doubling down on this, because obviously reaching out to the other parties has now been unsuccessful. Is he going to be running a dysfunctional government for the next 3 years?
Well, at the moment, it doesn't look good, right? And I think one of the issues is precisely what Juan David and I have kind of come to the conclusion is he lacks his own technocratic support. He's dealing with people who are in his ministers, who are in his circle, who haven't got experience of governing. And so it's inevitably going to be very difficult for him. But it's not only that is the problem. The problem is not only do they not have experience of governing, and also people who know Petro do acknowledge he's not a great communicator. He's a bit of a loner in his kind of the way he governs. And that's a difficult thing. But he's also under attack all the time. I mean, for me, I kind of sometimes think, how humanly does he live this? I mean, even what happened over his son, Nicolas, he's a father. And, this whole issue of what happened to his son personally must be really painful and terrible. And he didn't handle it very well. His son is also suffering from the fact he feels he had an absent father. But at the end of the day, Petro is a human being. And I think, he's got an incredible job on his hands, trying to bring about change without this support of a well-experienced, technocratic set of people around him, trying to build some sort of accord or agreement for change with people who really do not want him to survive and who will do everything they can to bring him down. It's a very difficult few years ahead. And what one can think of is maybe he won't achieve what he set out to achieve. One could think, has he put the issue of change on the agenda? A new debate, restarted the conversation, for instance, on violence, on what the meaning of security is. I mean, one of the criticisms one could make, perhaps, and I think this is true of the left in Latin America, that they don't treat security very seriously. So that in order to bring people with you for the total peace, I think he needs to have a good relationship and a new form of policing, which can really help people to feel safe and then accept that you can do negotiations with different actors. This is very difficult for him, right? So, and he's not alone. If people who in Latin America who want to bring about about any sort of change, they don't tend to have it already thought through the security policy, and people like AMLO in Mexico turns to the military, which is not a very progressive agenda for many. So I think he's facing very difficult obstacles, but who knows? Who knows the surprises of history? Climate change is here with us, and perhaps people will begin to realize that he's one of the few presidents that is taking climate change utterly seriously, and also trying to ensure that it's not the poor that suffer its consequences. He clearly wants to support the poor to be able to adapt to climate change in the rural areas, and also to find a sustainable agriculture that could actually help the country to wean itself off other imported food products.
It's interesting as we talk about, wind this down, but it's, the whole issue of this being the government of change, the government that to bring about change. And of course, scandal after scandal being revealed or very capably released at each point. People are saying, it's the government of change only because it's on the left. It's the government. It's the same politicians, the same type of government again, corrupt as usual. But I do think, he definitely wants change. I do believe this. And I don't want to anger listeners who perhaps are not in agreement, but he does represent a different politics than what we've had. And the scandals that he has, which are dreadful, and as you say, he's a father. How can he be dealing with that around his son, and the scandals ongoing? They do kind of pale in comparison to previous presidents and their scandals. You mentioned the parapolitica. Nothing is coming to the fore about President Duque and Jenny Hernandez. Santos' government has remained remarkably shielded from the Odebrecht scandal. And these are huge things. And now we're talking about something which I hate to say it in this fashion. It would be strange had there not been funds from illicit sources in a lot of political movements in Colombia, because it's so normal. And yet they seem to be really focusing on this fact.
Absolutely. And And I think it's important to remember, because you mentioned the ceremony of his inauguration and the different messages that took place. And in thinking about someone who's geared to change, you know, he absolutely made sure that that inauguration ceremony recognized indigenous population, the Afro-Colombian. He's got a vice president who's from the Afro-Colombian community. He has done his best, I think, to sort of reach out beyond a kind of narrow sense of who should dominate Colombia, who should govern Colombia, and to try and sort of, you know, also he's very interested in participation, which is not only to do with the sort of ELN process, but he's also trying to get participatory discussions going around, generally around total peace and around the other ideas he has for change. He had participatory processes before he did the National Development Plan. They weren't all tremendously successful, but some were. This isn't going to be, as we said before, the sort of quick fix where everything comes out perfectly, but he's trying to do something new in Colombia, which for me, having, you know, lived through the violences of Colombia for many decades, for me is very refreshing, important and vital. And the issue will be, you know, whether he can in the next 3 years at least leave a legacy of the fact that Colombia needs to think of a transformation in a much deeper way than perhaps some of the existing powers would want to accept.
Oh, well, thank you. I think that's a perfect place to end this. Thank you so much for these thoughts, and of course, we're going into great profundity about Colombia. Of course, we must keep looking out for your book, which will have a catchline, kind of the problem of reforms in Colombia, elites and violence in Latin America, and so on, with Juan David Velasco. As soon as you have a title, please let us know. When do we expect it to come out?
In the first months of next year.
Okay, so quite soon. So
yes,
quite
we
soon.
think probably March, April, if all goes well.
All right, well, keep us in the know, because of course, you know, as Colombian followers, Colombianists, we all want to know about this book. I'm sure you'll be doing a tour here in Bogota and in Colombia, so we'll meet in person then.
Definitely.
But let me take this moment to say thank you so much to Jenny Pearce, who is a research professor at the Latin American Caribbean Center of the London School of Economics, for her time and sharing some really quite incredible insights into the first year and future years of Gustavo Petro's presidency. Jenny, thank you for being on the LatinNews Podcast.
Thank you very much. Lovely to be here.
Thank you, everyone. And please, of course, subscribe to the LatinNews Podcast and check back in 2 weeks when we'll have a new episode out. I've been your host, Richard McCall, here in Bogota, Colombia. Thank you for listening.